So Semrad makes some kind of investigation, and he begins to wonder if maybe this idea that the patient is a whore comes out of certain feelings they're having in their body. All very familiar doctrine. Now, putting in perspective the primitive form of interpretation for Dr. Semrad was to say to the patient, maybe you think you're a whore because you're having these feelings in your body. He also called that a distancing remark, or giving perspective, since it gave a sort of distance from that sort of foolish idea to the patient by means of this primitive interpretation. You see my point, that these technical things I'm talking about are largely nonverbal or at the level of exclamations or even of introspective insights into one's own feeling. Now, when you come down, and this afternoon we'll talk more about this, but when you come down to the specific patterns of intervention that are suggested for some of the major psychotic states, you see this brought out even more clearly. For example, in paranoid states, and I thought that Dr. Searles picked this up very valuably in one of his early comments about the interview. In paranoid states, the patient is suffering from an inability to hold on to themselves, or as Semrad liked to put it, an irresistible impulse to share their discontent. An irresistible impulse to share their discontent. What a nice normalizing way to put a paranoid delusion. And you remember that this inability to take responsibility for the feelings, I thought Dr. Searles very wisely faulted Elvin for early in that interview by asking the patient prematurely to take responsibility before he knew where the patient was. But in general, what Semrad did was to respond to the paranoid situation by accepting responsibility in himself for the patient's feelings. So the patient was not told, these are really yours and not mine, but the patient was essentially given reason to believe, mostly by Semrad's posture, mostly by his attitude, and most of this is attitudinal treatment. Mostly by his attitude, he was essentially told, of course you can't hang on to it. I'm right over here, give it to me. The same thing was illustrated by his treatment of the catatonic states, where the lesion was thought to be in the inability to feel worth having, worth being, inability to feel cared for. And so the obligation, therefore, on the therapist, he said, was to care for the patient. And this took generally, again, attitudinal, geographic expression, the willingness to sit with someone, the willingness to be there with them, to express not directly by any kind of verbal explanation, but simply by his presence, that there was someone who was willing to suffer with them. Well, these are the kinds of answers that he gave, in my opinion, to the question with which I started these remarks, the question that Ives Hendrick asked. If direct verbal, explanatory, interpretive interventions are essentially short-circuited by our dynamic knowledge of the mind, how are we to deal with the essentially powerful currents that are running in our patients? And you see here the kinds of answers he tried to begin to formulate, so that instead of talking about, explaining, intellectualizing with our patients, we were able to both find them and then to work with them in some kind of an effective way. Thank you very much.
Now, open things up for discussion. I plan to be the first commentator or something. I want to say before we do start that there are there are three microphones in the three aisles, and when anyone wants to speak, even though it may take as many as 20 seconds to get from where you're sitting to the nearest microphone, it's well worth the time. Otherwise, you can't be heard. And if you're going to speak, we all want to hear what you have to say. My comments are very brief. I think that it has to be emphasized that it's clear that, and I'm addressing the differences between Dr. Searles and Dr. Semrad, that Dr. Searles and Dr. Semrad are two among perhaps a dozen historic figures who are distinguished by their great capacity to interview difficult patients. And they have trained many others, they've influenced many others. Privately, those who have been influenced by these leaders like to think that they perhaps can do it as well, but we all know that it's very difficult to approximate what these people with great training, I'm not saying that it's not rooted in the theoretical understanding that they also have, but who have a gift and a genius for reaching people. Winnicott is one. There are many. Well, there are not that many. And I think that the experience that young trainees have was quoted by several people in trying to mimic is often amusing, sometimes disastrous. But even those who are more experienced find it difficult to accomplish this. I think, talking about Winnicott, I think whenever Winnicott would speak and talk, for instance, about his using the squiggle with which he could bring a lifetime of pathology into one set of interchanges, the stationery stores in Boston or New York, wherever, would be absolutely stripped of all papers and pencils. Everybody's busy squiggling, but very few people would get anywhere with the understanding of their patients. So I think it's important to bear in mind that whatever they may say about what they're doing, and I think that Leston speaks eloquently in exposition of Elvin Semrad's position, perhaps better than Elvin himself could have done, and Dr. Searles gives his own exposition, that I believe that what they did carried a certain quality that is beyond what is explicable. And what I think is important about that is that there is a sense of confidence, rightness, knowledge, and capacity to bear what goes on, now whatever the context. Now specifically, I think the differences, my view of the differences globally between Dr. Searles's approach to these interviews and Dr. Semrad's is that one thing was explicit with one and implicit with the other, and the reverse as you go back and forth. That with Dr. Semrad, and I think that Leston mentioned this, he said that the transference was silent. My view is that the transference issues were implicit. They were not made explicit. And perhaps very few people, but Dr. Semrad, with his massive presence and its simplicity that sort of radiated many things, that allowed this whole area to be somewhat implicit, not as detailed clearly as if it became explicit. On the other hand, what was explicit with Dr. Semrad was endorsing the connection and the basis for an observing ego, for later insight and later exchange. That was explicit. Whereas it was the reverse with, is the reverse with Dr. Searles. And that if you look just simply at focusing on the rage and hatred that may well be a part of many psychotic patients' innards, if that is all that's being done, one cannot help but imagine that this would be enormously dislocating and lead to disintegration before one's eyes, when in fact this is not the case when handled by someone like Dr. Searles and by Dr. Searles himself, because what is implicit there is the contract, the understanding, and the intellectual framework of what is going on. So that the net effect is that pathology or intensity of pain of one kind or another is encompassed. There is an understanding that there are two people present and that one of them is bearing it. I think that applies to both. Now, we discussed how to proceed from this point, and the speakers all agreed that it was best just to open things up to everybody, including themselves. There will be no formal sequence of do you want to respond. However, anyone who at the table can take the microphone in front of them too. Would you like to?
If you feel. This departs a bit from what we had agreed on with Dr. Gare. After Hearing Dr. Haven's remarks, it does seem appropriate for me to speak for a very few minutes. We're all greatly indebted to Dr. Havens for his remarks, which I note he made without the benefit of any notes whatever. I greatly envy someone who is able to do that as in the manner that he did. We're indebted to him because for a number of reasons. One is he knew Semrad so well and can explain to us and to me and the rest of us who didn't know Semrad what lay behind much of Dr. Semrad's ways of functioning. I mentioned to Dr. Havens that I'd read with a great deal of interest his own book on participant observation, and I recommend it to any of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading it. I want to make, just for a very few minutes here, comments about a few of the things he says. Ives Hendrick, Semrad's most valued teacher, spoke of the problem of how to get the doctors to stop talking. Now, my wife, before our marriage, when she visited my parental home, was amazed at how much each of my parents talked. And when I got into analysis, I was in analysis about 6 years, and I think literally was not silent for 2 minutes in those 6 years. And one time in the middle of a session, after a very brief, unusual exchange between the analyst and myself, he ordinarily spoke only in the closing minutes of the session and then to offer an interpretation. This time in the middle of a session, we had talked briefly about something, and I, lying on the couch, then asked politely, "Shall I go on dissociating?" So I certainly did use conversation as a defense. There's no denying that. And it was in the years of my work at Chestnut Lodge that I learned a great deal about the value of silence, and I can claim to have probably spent as many hours as almost anybody in the world in silence with patients. I have learned to be silent, and it was no easy thing. Now, we come to a brief mention of this one interview kind of situation. Dr. Havens implies that I made clear enough that I would have talked much more than Semrad did, and I think indeed I would have. In contrast to many of the therapy sessions I have with patients, and in my office practice, my patients, most of whom have never been psychotic, and most of whom are colleagues in psychiatry and related professions, would find that I say nothing except the opening salutation and the closing comment, often for week after week. I am very, very silent in my office work with most of my patients. But Dr. Havens says the purpose of the first interview is to have a second interview. True enough, but that ain't the case in this instance. There's only going to be the one interview. And that does have a special quality about it that affects me. I think it tends to make me more talkative. And I always interview patients who are in therapy at the time. I would not interview someone who didn't have a therapist available to pick up pieces that might need to be picked up. I tell you, I am really staggered at how much loved Semrad was. I asked someone at the table here when he died, and I learned that he died in 76. And I had been wondering, was it that he died only a year ago? Are you people in some stage of grief that you idealize him so? That apparently isn't the answer. I guess I have to believe that he was a genuinely very, very much loved person. I honestly fear that you're on the verge of making him a saint, and I really question that, because I haven't heard a harsh word about the man except out of my own chest.
Harold, that's... What?
You're here to save us, Harold.
Hey, Les says I'm here to save you. Well, I tell you, I think you need saving. I really do. Now, I'll soon desist, but 30 years ago about, Frida von Reichmann was the center of an analogous degree of, I would say, worship. She was worshipped not as Semrad is, because she could love so well. It wasn't that simple. She had intuition that surpasses the human bounds. That's why she was worshipped. But love was a very much part of it. She was seen also to have really a kind of love that went beyond the human pale. And we had on our Chestnut Lodge staff at the time a very witty, competitive bird who I had a dream about one night in which he was standing across the room and standing there and saying to me in slow professorial tones, "Harold, I wonder whether what you have is omnipotence or ominous impotence." And I always took that dream and still take it as evidence of what a witty guy he is. But I get back to the point that this same colleague said to me one time in a staff conference, I guess where Frida had presented to us, he said, "Harold, did you ever notice something about how when Frida's face relaxes into its usual hostile mask?" And I thought, my God, how could he think such a thing? And then I started noticing, and by God, he was right. Well, you see, what I guess I'm missing is where the hell is Elvin Semrad's hostile mask? I want to hear about it.
I must say, Dr. Searles, that when I was discussing this moderating job yesterday, that my first impression when I read your remarks was that perhaps this is what you had done. You'd meant to save us, and I said this to help us mourn, and I said this to some of the other participants on the faculty, and they said, no, that's not the case. I think it may not have been the case, as a matter of fact.
It was not mine.
So they were correct. It's just is evolving this way.
Yeah, I hadn't known till I got here, really, the tremendous extent of the esteem in which he was held. I knew he had been a very beloved teacher, but I tell you, I do miss simply the ordinary, normal human ambivalence that we human beings have about any other human being. That's my thing.
Susan.
You have to treat the whole psychiatric society.
You got to push the button, whichever way it isn't.
Okay, thank you. I have two observations that I would like to offer for your comments. One is that, Dr. Searles, I've always appreciated what you said about advising us to be careful not to try to be too loving to patients because they would feel inadequate and so forth, and that has helped me a lot in my work. But something that's clear to me all the time about what happened with Dr. Semrad is that the patients who you described have so much more comfort with their hostility and aggression and have so much more difficulty in loving. That actually, I think what he did was to make it safer for them to get in touch with their capacity to love, that they have a lot more trouble loving than they have hating, and it's a lot easier to fight, I find myself, with patients than it is to facilitate their safety with a more positive experience. And I think that his purpose in getting to the positive stuff first had to do with recognizing that in order to be able to let go of the objects, they had to acknowledge that they had an attachment in the first place. And that I think the trick is that so often it's so hard to get to the acknowledgement because people have so much rage and hate and anger and revulsion and resentment at what's been done to them all their lives by these objects that it takes an awfully long time before they can get down to the basics of that they really did love these people in the first place. So, I mean, that's the first thing I really like to possibly say response on. I have one other part of it to sit down, and that is that your approach of carefully and relentlessly going after medical transference through picking up all kinds of transference associations with the patient invites a kind of scatter. I mean, there's limitless realms into which the material can go. And I think that what Dr. Semrad did was to leave the patient and have a basic structure based on his observations of the common experiences in human life. And that he created a structure which later he could explore the scattered bits of transference that came about. But that I think in some ways, it's a strange word to say, but I think it might have been a more efficient approach. And anyway, it gives me more comfort than just inviting it scatter and not even sure whether I'm going to be adequate for 100 years or not.
One of the things, I won't make an attempt to reply directly to your questions. I don't feel able to cope with them, I guess, right at the moment. I do want to say something of the importance of the patient's identifications with the aggressors from the past. These are a very, very important, tangible part of what happens between oneself and the patient. And the kindly, loving, empathic in the usual sense approach from which the interviewer emerges as so vastly more loving an individual than the patient, to my mind, does not take adequate measure of the patient's own identifications with these miserable, brutal, bastardly sons of bitches out of the past. And for a person to develop a really strong sense of personal identity, to my mind, that would involve coming to terms with, the patient's coming to terms with these enormously important formative identifications with her biological parents and siblings. I don't see any way around that. I really don't. And I can say that one of my main concerns is that a teacher not be so revered that he makes the task of emulating him seem beyond human reach. That is, in working with schizophrenic patients, where there tends to be so much stirring up of hate and fear and unpleasant emotions, the therapist needs to have some kind of ordinary human-sized, you could say, working superego. To my mind, he must not expect himself to be able to maintain a superlatively loving, gentle, kindly, considerate stance with any kind of consistency. He must instead, in his daily work with these people, assume that he is going to be feeling considerably detached much of the time, that he's going to be feeling that he's a terrible brute because he's going to be put in, inevitably, to an appreciable extent, in the transference position of one or another terrible brute. I don't mean that he should embrace that transference role and act upon it and simply repeat the damage that has been done to the patient in the past, but that he must assume that he's going to be regarded genuinely and persistently and over a long course of time as being more bad than good. and it's bound to make contact with aspects of his own personal identity that are not among his most lovable aspects. Therefore, the therapist's kind of working superego should be one where feelings of hate and feelings of cruelty, feelings of intense disapproval, all kinds of unpleasant feelings are very much part of what he's used to. I don't hold a brief that hate is the only authentic human emotion. I definitely do not. But I say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Now, if Semrad trained dozens and dozens of people who have followed in his footsteps, who have gone out into the world interested in working with ill people and continuing to work with them year after year, then he did what he no doubt set out to do, and I cannot have any quarrel with him whatsoever. But I would enjoin you not to feel that you have to be some kind of superlatively loving angel to qualify to work in this field, because that ain't the case.
Bill, and then Myron.
I'm Dr. Barnum. I was a resident with Dr. Semrad some 20 years ago, and I want to reassure Dr. Searles that the residents were on to him, if you will. What I'm going to tell you is a nickname, which is a dreadful nickname. And I think it connotes more familiarity with his rather enormous passivity, and that he was much more comfortable with positive than with negative feelings. Succinctly, the nickname captured that, because the nickname was Malignant Marshmallow. That was said at the same time all, including myself, were filled with a great deal of admiration, respect, love, if you will. But we were aware that there was another side.
I think we've heard some very brilliant talks, and I'm very grateful. My only concern is that it gets polarized. The brilliance is so dazzling that we flip back and forth. I would hate to see this Kopach-Kernberg split now be extended to the Searle-Semrad Haven split. And the problem reminds me a little bit of what, to paraphrase Pascal, has said, that a therapist does not show his greatness by being at one extreme or another, but by touching both at once. And I think our task is really to touch these two extremes. And Les, I think, has indicated one way that Semrad did by dealing with transference non-verbally. I think Dr. Searles does deal with pain, even by dealing with the transfers. Under certain conditions, to be told directly something or interpreted directly, I find much more gratifying than I often found Dr. Semrad's oblique, privacy-respecting, partly invading, mysterious and baffling tangential comments about people. And I would leave the room thinking, what the hell do you mean by that? And I think under certain conditions, those remarks, or as he would call them, interpretations, are fine. In other conditions, I much prefer Dr. Searles. At any rate, I'd like to hear the panel or another member speak to the issue of the integration of these two approaches rather than the delineation of the contrast.
Well, in that regard, my own thought about that is that part of your remarks, Dr. Searle, not to keep this polarized, but that you said that you were surprised that Elvis Semrad could ignore these things and be such an eminent psychoanalyst. Now, I picked that just to say there's an apparent appeal to orthodoxy, and yet you would hardly characterize yourself as an orthodox, easily reproduced anything. And I think part of the message of using oneself, that if I would guess that both you and Dr. Semrad and every other proper leader in the field would recognize that our personalities are therapeutic instruments, and one can only use the personality that one has. If one is inclined to shy away from certain things, but still can deal with certain things, that's the way you have to proceed. So that I think that's another aspect, that some personalities perhaps should never get into this field, but there's a wide range of personalities that can effectively do that.
I'm tempted to quote a remark that Dr. Jack Green once made in this contrasting things that Mickey Sheriff has asked us to integrate. My God, Mickey, before lunch? But it's a line from Conrad, and maybe he would get it right, but I only remember it vaguely. But he says, Conrad writes, one comes out of the jungle onto the plain. One comes out of the jungle of the unconscious and the complexities of transference and intertransference. One comes out of the jungle onto the plain. There is a vast amount of light, but very little to see.
Today's second-day two-day presentation, touched a somewhat venerated tone was in Don Gary's opening remarks of this presentation. I thought that in contrast to yesterday and in the workshops in the afternoon, a certain critical rigor did enter the conversation in a number of the situations, obviously others perhaps different term. And I certainly support the resident's comment that for a first-year resident or even a second, third-year resident going through the Master Level program, the kind of frustration at mostly about Dr. Semrad's refusal to engage in a struggle with the resident in a conference was one of the most powerful wellsprings of ambivalence toward him. And it was several years later that what he had to say was taught. This frustration took its form not only in the deluded marshmallow, the notion of someone whose passivity made it impossible to struggle with, but also someone who at a certain stage of the resident's development would inspire contempt because of his utter ignorance of the appropriate dosage of Melrose that the patient would be required beyond. And Dr. Semrad made naked his inability to cope with such specific questions, which he simply deflected. And of course, to residents at that point 15 to medicate, this was a very serious deficiency and a powerful grounds for doubt and skepticism about his ability. I want to speak about the common ground between Dr. Searles and Dr. Semrad in one respect, that I have fairly direct evidence from conversations with patients whom Dr. Semrad interviewed. And on two occasions, Dr. Searles said he came to Mass Mental and did a conference, which was perceived as really fairly intense and stressful to the patient. I know from direct follow-up that both of those patients did feel understood, and in fact wanted to continue the interview. And what I want to point out is that I believe that both therapists, both interviewers, were able to leave the patient feeling understood, which I've come around to believing is perhaps the single most important issue, the single unknown whole therapeutic work. But the different parts of them were being understood, and that the other parts were, as practitioners have commented, earlier or developed in the subsequent work, or belonged to the office and not the didactic setting in which many of these incidents occurred. The final point I wanted to underscore was in Dr. Hagen's book, and I have to paraphrase it due to limitations of memory, and it's about someone who we don't usually think of in connection with Dr. Semrad, and that's Harry Stock Sullivan. And there's an incident that Les quotes, which has to do with, I think it's a German electrician, and the electrician is talking about union dues, and his voice changes, and someone begins to wonder if there's something fishy about that, and he then says, I gather the payment of such dues is almost never neglected by members of your profession. And the person says, yes, that's absolutely true. And Sullivan then says, surely you, of course, has never been in the least bit negligent about this responsibility. And the person then says, well, in fact, I actually have shortchanged distrustful. In other words, that since the anticipation is that the currency of the relationship will be the patient's distrust of Sullivan's benevolent feelings toward him, with superego, who was critical of his non-paying dues, that Sullivan takes this extreme posture of being totally trusting and willing to see the best of intentions of the patient, who can then in that context admit the negative. And the question then occurs to, in the interview that we sort of take of it, many times Semrad seems to be doing just that. That he says when the patient is struggling with her rage and murder and apathy toward her own child, that he asks innocently, did the pediatrician know how much you loved your child? And in the context of that elaborate lack of suspicion on the negative side, the patient can say about the baby that she felt nothing, and about the father that she wanted him to die, and so forth. Always in the context when Semrad is elaborately distrustful, elaborately, elaborately prejudiced about the positive side, and then in the context of the patient bring forward the negative. And I wonder if that is one of the things that accounts for the difference in the style, and the fact that in fact both interviews, Dr. Searles and Dr. Semrad, do contain negative content in a different context.
I want to thank Dr. Searles for a very emphatic and intuitive analysis of the interview research. I really have been troubled by the ways, based on my research on Leston's character, I've been troubled by the ways it seems to me that Dr. Semrad had missed the boat as far as the precipitant of this patient's psychosis, which was that she didn't